Every frontier town picked someone to laugh at, and Coyote Springs picked the wrong woman. She arrived alone, paid cash for the creek lot no one wanted, and built a one-room cabin with no bed in it. The town decided she was mad, and the man who wanted her water made a bet she would freeze before Christmas. She built a clay stove instead of a bedroom, and she never told a soul why. Stay until the end to see how the design the whole town mocked became the only shelter left standing when the killer January storm came down off the plains. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The supply wagon rolled into Coyote Springs on the last warm day of October 1887, and the only passenger left on the bench was a woman no one in Montana Territory had ever seen the like of. She stepped down, carrying a lacquered wooden case in one hand and a rolled futon in the other, and the dust swallowed her ankles as she walked toward the land office without looking back at the driver. Her hair was jet black and pinned in a traditional Japanese knot. Her eyes dark and almond-shaped above high cheekbones, and she wore a deep indigo kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat that hung past her knees. She didn't glance at the saloon or the general store or the men who had stopped nailing shingles to watch her pass, and she walked on the way a person walks when they have already decided where they're going. The creek lot had been empty for 3 years because it sat low and flooded in spring and held mosquitoes in summer, and the only man who wanted it was Hollis Crane, who owned the general store and most of the usable water rights in the basin. Crane had been waiting for the county to give it up for back taxes so he could buy it for the price of a saddle. When the woman laid gold on the land agent's counter and walked out with the deed, the news crossed the street faster than she did. By the time she reached the lot, 6 men were already leaning on the corral fence to see what she would do, and Hollis Crane was among them. She set the lacquered case down at the edge of the lot and studied the ground for a long time before she did anything else. The creek bank rose on the far side, and below the grass the soil was the color of wet iron, dense and thick and streaked with gray. She knelt and dug a handful of it and rolled it between her fingers and brought it to her nose, and something in her face settled the way a face settles when a question has been answered. The men on the fence took her for a fool because only a fool would pay gold for a flood lot and then kneel in the dirt to smell it, and she didn't care what they took her for. Nash was the one who hauled her lumber. He was a widowed rancher who kept 40 head on the ridge above town and spoke when he had something to say and not before, and he had watched her from the back of the crowd without laughing. The next morning, his buckboard went down to the lot with rough-sawn planks and a box of nails, and he asked her in 3 words where she wanted them. She pointed to the flat ground above the flood line, and he set the load down and didn't ask what she was building. He had learned long ago that a person's reasons were their own, and that the frontier sorted everyone out soon enough without his help. Crane came by before the foundation was finished, walking the property line like a man measuring a coat he meant to take off someone. He offered to buy the lot back for what she paid, plus 10%, and he smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that expects to win. She looked at him the way she had looked at the clay, and then she told him no. And the no was so flat and final that the smile broke before he could catch it. He walked back up to the store, and the first wager of the winter was already forming in his head. She raised the cabin in 11 days, and it was exactly what she had paid for and nothing more. 1 room, 1 door, 1 window cut to the south. A packed earth floor, smooth and hardened with creek water. There was no loft, no interior wall, no frame for a bed, no corner set aside for sleeping. The whole structure was smaller than Crane's storeroom, and the men who came to watch the roof go on agreed it would be a tight coffin for a body in winter. Nash did the heavy lifting for wages, She counted out in coins, and he didn't comment on the absence of a bedroom, though he noticed it. What she built after the walls was the thing that brought the whole town down to the creek to stare. She dug the gray clay out of the bank in baskets and carried it to the cabin, and she mixed it with sand and creek water and a handful of straw until it was the texture of bread dough, and then she began to shape a stove against the back wall with her bare hands. It rose slow and thick and almost round, wider at the base than a man's reach, and tapering to a flat top, the walls of it as deep as her forearm from face to face. She smoothed and packed and let each layer set before she laid the next, and she worked at it the way a potter works, which is to say she worked at it as though no one were watching. By the end of the second week, the stove dominated the room. It had a firebox low on one side, a cooking surface of flat stone set into the top, and a chimney of stacked clay tile that went up through the roof. The walls of it were enormous, thicker than any stove anyone had seen, built like a small kiln rather than a cooking hearth. The town stood in the doorway and laughed, because a stove this big in a cabin this small was absurd, and a cabin this small with no bed was more absurd still. Crane called it a fool's oven, and the name stuck, and it traveled up and down the street within the hour. There was one detail no one quite knew what to do with. Set into the flank of the stove, at the height of a woman's hip, was a wooden panel fitted into a clay lip, closed flush and sealed with a strip of felt. It looked like a cleaning hatch or a draft control or something a potter adds because the shape wants it there. Nash was the only one who looked at it long enough to wonder, and he didn't ask, because he had seen the way she built, and he understood that she didn't build anything she didn't mean. The other thing the town noticed after a few weeks was that no one ever saw her go to bed. The window went dark early and came back late, and a low fire glowed in the stove through the night, but there was never a lamp moving toward a bed, never a shape on a mattress, never the sound of someone settling onto a straw tick. She slept somewhere, because she was alive and clear-eyed every morning. But where she slept was a question the cabin refused to answer, and the wooden panel on the fool's oven was the only part of the room that didn't explain itself. The first cold came in November, thin and testing, the kind of frost that kills the garden, but not the man. The town pulled its shutters and banked its fires and settled into the long wait, and the talk in the general store turned to the woman at the creek and how long she would last. Coyote Springs had seen plenty of greenhorns break by Christmas. Foreign woman alone in a bedless cabin with a freakish clay oven was, in the town's reckoning, the safest bet anyone had laid all year. Crane made it official on a Thursday, standing at the counter with his thumbs in his vest. He put up a month's takings that she would be gone, frozen, or begging on his doorstep before the new year, and he let any man match it who wanted to. 4 of them did, and the pot climbed, and the story of the bet ran through the saloons before supper. It was the kind of wager that makes a town into an audience, and Coyote Springs settled in to watch the woman lose. She had no interest in the wager, because the wager assumed she would fight the winner the way they fought it, and she didn't intend to fight it that way at all. The storm that would settle the bet was still 2 months off, building itself somewhere out over the cold country to the north, and she was already building the answer to it out of creek clay and patience. Nash refused to take the bet, and his refusal annoyed Crane more than the woman had. He told the room plainly that January was what killed people on the plains and not December, and that the worst storms he had survived had come on a warm morning with no warning at all, the sky soft as spring, and the wind dead calm, right up to the hour it turned. He said it as a fact and not as a defense of her, and he left without betting, and the men left behind decided he had gone soft over a foreign face. He rode down to the creek that evening and told her the same thing he had told the store. He said the killing weather came fast and from a clear sky, and that a body could go from sweating to freezing in the time it took to saddle a horse, and that the only people who survived were the ones who had already decided to stay. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked him only one thing, which was whether the gray clay in the bank ran deep. It ran to the water table, he told her, and she nodded once, and he rode home, and that night the light in her window burned later than any other in town. She banked her fire after the cooking was done, the way she did every night, raking the coals low and sealing the draft so the heat would hold. From the road, you could see the cabin glow at the seams, a warm line at the window, and a thin warmth leaking from the edge of the wooden panel, and the town took it for the waste of a woman who didn't know how to manage a fire. No one guessed that the heat was going somewhere on purpose. The women of Coyote Springs had their own opinion, and it was kinder than the men's and harder to refuse. They saw a lone woman with no bed and no sister to advise her, and they decided that whatever else she was, she shouldn't have to sleep on the bare ground through a Montana winter. They gathered a straw mattress, a stitched quilt, and a pair of wool blankets, and they carried the load down to her door in a buckboard with the air of a delegation, bringing sense to a savage. She met them at the door and listened to the whole speech, the part about Christian charity, and the part about a woman's comfort, and the part about how no decent person could let another go cold. The thanks she gave them was real, but she declined the mattress. She kept the quilt, because refusing everything would have been a door slammed in a kind face, and she folded it over her arm and stood in the doorway with it while they tried to make her take the rest. They left with the mattress still in the wagon, certain now that she was either mad or planning to leave before the snow got serious and the kindness curdled into a verdict as they rode back up the hill. Nash had watched the whole visit from his wagon at the corral, and after the women left, he brought down a sled load of dry pine and stacked it against the cabin wall without being asked. She offered him tea, and he took it, because the air was sharp and because he wanted a reason to be inside the room. The tea was green and bitter and smelled like cut grass, nothing like the coffee he knew, and he drank it without comment and let his eyes move around the cabin while she poured. The room was warmer than it had any right to be for a single banked fire, warm enough that his hands loosened and his collar went slack, and he couldn't find where the heat was coming from. His eye kept returning to the wooden panel on the flank of the stove. It was fitted so clean it nearly disappeared into the clay, and the felt strip around it was warm to the look, the way a stone is warm after the sun has been on it. He almost asked twice, and both times he swallowed the question, because a person who builds a thing that fine doesn't owe a stranger the explanation of it. He set the cup down and thanked her for the tea and left, and the panel stayed shut and the warmth stayed in the room. Crane came down that same week, but he came alone and after dark, and he came to pressure. He stood in the doorway and talked about the lot. Again, the price doubled now, his voice easy and his eyes measuring the room. Yuki let him talk, and she didn't move from the bench by the stove, and beside the door, upright in a carved wooden stand, rested a long-handled blade with a curved steel head, a naginata her father had kept, steel so dark it caught no lamplight. Crane's gaze found it the way a man's gaze finds a rattlesnake on a path, and he stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked at the blade, and he looked at her, and he read the room correctly, and he left without touching anything. The naginata stayed where it was, quite as the rest of her. Nash came back on a cold Sunday, the kind of day where the horse's breath hangs in clouds, and the creek skin freezes solid by noon, and she let him watch her work. She had a soup on the stove that would take the whole afternoon, and she fed the fire steadily and turned the coals and let the thick clay walls drink the heat for hours while the cabin filled with steam and the smell of root vegetables and dried fish. He sat on a stool by the door and didn't offer to help because she hadn't asked, and he watched the way a man watches weather coming, which is to say, without speaking. When the soup was done, she did the thing he hadn't seen her do before. She raked the coals down to a low red bed and sealed the draft with a clay plug, and then she laid her palm flat against the outer wall of the stove and held it there. He watched her hand stay still on the clay, and after a moment he reached out and laid his own hand beside hers. The wall was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warm that a stone holds on a summer evening, except that the sun had been down for hours and the air outside was sharp enough to crack a bucket. She didn't say anything, and she let his hand tell him. He understood it slow, the way understanding comes when the body figures it out before the head does. The clay was thick, thicker than any stovall had reason to be, and it had been soaking up the fire's heat all afternoon like a sponge soaks water. Now that the fire was low, the clay was giving the heat back, slow and even, radiating it into the room hour after hour. The stove was a storehouse first, a wall-sized jar for heat, and she had built it fat on purpose so it would hold the day's fire long into the night. Cooking was the smaller half of what it did. She gave him the only line she would give him. Her grandmother's house in the old country was heated this way. She said the walls built thick from river clay, and the day's cooking fire warming the family till morning because the clay wouldn't let the heat go. She said it without ceremony, the way a person states a fact they have lived with since childhood. And she didn't explain the old country or the grandmother or why any of it had crossed an ocean with her. Nash didn't ask. He looked at the wall, and he looked at the wooden panel, and he put the two of them together in his mind and came up one answer short, because the heat in the room still didn't account for a wall that warm and a woman who never went to a bed. He thanked her for the soup and rode home thinking about it, and the thought stayed with him through the week that the stove was a jar for heat and the panel was a door into the jar, and that the missing bed and the warm wall were a single puzzle. He didn't have the last piece, and he didn't press for it, because he had decided that whatever she was doing it on purpose, and a person that deliberate didn't need his help to survive the winter. The deep cold came in the second week of December, the kind that snaps bridle leather and makes a man's lungs ache when he draws a full breath. Nash was up on the ridge checking a calf that hadn't come in, and the sky closed behind him while he worked, and by the time he started down the trail, the cold had turned the world white with frost, and his horse was picking its steps on ice. He was closer to the creek than to his own place, and the cold was in his fingers and his knees by the time he knocked on her door, and he wouldn't have knocked at all if he had been able to feel his hands. She opened the door and read the state of him in one glance, and she pulled him inside without a word and shut out the dark. She put him on the floor by the banked hearth and wrapped him in the quilt the women had brought, and she set a cup of something hot in his hands and let him shake until the shaking slowed. The cabin was warm, warmer than the fire alone could account for, warm enough that the cold came out of his clothes in waves of steam. He drank and didn't speak, and she didn't speak, and the stove ticked softly in the wall beside them. He woke in the small hours with the cabin still warm and the fire long down to ash, and that was the thing that shouldn't have been. A banked fire gives a room an hour, maybe two, and then the cold comes back in under the door and through the floor, and the temperature falls to the temperature of the night. This room hadn't fallen. It held its warmth the way a closed hand holds a coal, and the air near the stove was almost living, and Nash lay on the floor with his eyes open and tried to make the arithmetic work and couldn't. Then he saw her move. She crossed the room in the dark, silent on the packed earth, and she slid the wooden panel open with one hand. A soft glow rolled out, and with it a breath of stored heat that he felt on his face from across the room. A warmth like the inside of a kiln, gentle and deep. In the light, he caught the edge of something hollowed into the thick clay, a low chamber lined with pale cloth, a futon folded into a space the clay had been built around. She eased the panel almost shut and crossed back, and she didn't look at him. But she knew he was awake, and he knew she knew. They didn't speak of it that night, or at dawn, or when she fed him rice and dried plum and sent him out into a cold that had eased a single degree. The only exchange they had was at the door, when he turned to thank her, and she met his eyes for a moment and said nothing, and the nothing was an answer. He had seen the inside of the wall, and he wouldn't tell anyone, and she hadn't asked him not to, because the kind of person who keeps a secret without being asked is the kind of person who doesn't need to ask. He rode home with the shape of that warm hollow burning in his mind, and the town's laughter about the fool's oven suddenly sounded like the noise of people who had never been inside the room. January the 12th broke soft and warm enough to fool the plains and fool the people on it. The snow melted off the south-facing roofs and ran in the gutters, and the children went to school without their coats, and the men came out to do chores in their shirt sleeves, because the air felt like the leading edge of spring. It was the kind of morning the frontier uses to lure its people out of doors, gentle and false, and every soul in Coyote Springs stepped into it and trusted it, because a warm day in January is a mercy, and the human heart wants mercy to be real. Yuki didn't trust it. She read the morning the way her grandmother had taught her to read the sea before a typhoon, and the small signs that the land gives before it changes its mind. The horses in the corral were restless and wouldn't settle to their hay. Birds had gone quiet an hour before they should have, and the sparrows that nested under the eaves of the store were gone as though something had called them south in a hurry. The air pressure sat wrong in her ears, a low, full feeling she had learned as a child on the coast of the old country, the feeling that comes when the sky is holding its breath. And on the northwest horizon, so faint it was almost a thought, the blue had thinned to a pale band that didn't belong above a warm morning. She began to prepare, and she prepared without announcing why, because the town would have laughed, and the morning was too soft to make anyone believe her. The fire she built in the stove went as high as it would go, and she fed it for hours, loading the thick clay walls with heat the way a woman loads a jar with water for a dry season. She raked the coals deep and banked them, sealed the window with the spare quilt, and stuffed the door frame with rolled cloth, then filled 2 pots with creek water and set a sack of rice and a bundle of dried soba on the bench. Inside the alcove, she laid the futon, and she checked the naginata by the door and put a second log within reach. Then she went to find them. She went to Nash first, because he would listen, and she told him on his doorstep that a storm was coming before dark, and that it would be the worst he had seen, and that he shouldn't be caught out on the ridge, and he should tie down anything that could blow. He didn't ask her how she knew. He had seen what she built, and he had felt the wall, and he trusted her the way he trusted the ache in his own knees before a blue norther, and he was already moving toward the barn before she finished talking. She went to Crane next, in the store with customers at the counter, and she told him the same thing in the same flat voice. Crane looked at her, and then at the warm light coming through the window, and he laughed in her face and told her to go back where she came from, and 2 of the men at the counter laughed with him, and one of them didn't. The warmth peaked around midday, and then the wind shifted, and the shift was wrong, the kind of wrong that raises the hair on a working man's arms. While no one watched, the pale band on the northwest horizon had thickened, and now it was a wall, dark and heavy and building, moving the way a thunderhead moves, except that it was January and there should have been no thunderhead. Yuki was already inside with the door shut and the fire high, and Nash was in his barn with the stock tied and the shutters barred, and he was watching that dark line climb the sky and remembering everything she had told him and everything he had told the store about warm mornings and killing storms. The town was still outdoors, still in shirt sleeves, still doing chores, because the morning was warm and the dark line was far away and the plains had been kind to them all winter. It hit like a shot. One moment the air was mild and the next it was a wall of driven snow and a wind that screamed across the basin with the voice of something alive and furious, and the temperature fell as though someone had opened a door onto the deep of space. A warm morning turned to 40 below in the span of a few hours, and worse out on the open ground, and the snow was powder, and the wind was hurricane, and the visibility dropped to nothing in the time it took a man to cross his own yard. The frontier had shown its mercy in the morning, and now it showed its teeth, and the teeth went all the way down to the bone of the land. The people, caught outside, went down first. A ranch hand, trying to reach the corral, lost the barn in the white, and walked past it, and was found the next spring in a draw a quarter-mile south. Out in the open fields, the cattle froze where they stood. Whole herds locked on their feet, and the horses that weren't under cover broke their leads and ran and were found in drifts against the fences. The town itself didn't die at once, but it began to die by degrees, because the big drafty houses that looked so solid couldn't hold their heat, and the stoves in them couldn't keep up with the cold coming in through every crack. Crane's house was the finest in Coyote Springs, and it was the coldest, because fine on the frontier means big, and big means volume, and volume is the enemy of warmth when the fuel runs low. His stove was cast iron, and it threw heat fast and lost it faster, and the rooms were high, and the walls were thin, and the wind found every joint in the siding and pushed the cold through it like water through cloth. He fed the fire until his wood was gone, and then he fed it furniture, and the house stayed cold anyway, and his wife wrapped the children in every blanket they owned and watched their breath hang in the air above the bed. The stove that had seemed so sensible in November was a failure by midnight, because it gave heat only while it burned, and it burned only while there was wood, and the wood was running out. Nash was the one who almost didn't make it. He had gone up to the high pasture for a stray he wouldn't leave, because a rancher doesn't leave stock if he can help it, and the storm came down between him and town while he was still a mile out. The horse turned into the wind and fought him every step, and the cold got into his legs and his hands and his chest, and the world went white and then gray, and then began to close at the edges. He found the creek by the sound of it and followed it down by memory more than sight, because sight had gone to a hand's length. Counting the bends the way she had once counted coins, he knew the cabin was the last warm thing on the creek before he ever saw it. He beat on the door with the side of his fist because his fingers wouldn't close, and she opened it and pulled him in and shut out the white roar, and the storm was on the other side of a plank of wood, and the cabin was warm. He stood in the doorway with ice in his beard and his breath coming in long shudders. The heat of the room hit him like a living thing, and he looked at her and then at the panel on the flank of the stove, and he understood for the first time why a woman who could have built a bedroom had spent 2 months building a stove instead. The cold deepened through the night, and the town went dark around her, house by house, as the chimneys choked with snow and the fires died to nothing. Inside, the cabin held. His thick clay wall bled the heat she had stored all morning back into the room, slow and even, exactly as the wall had been built to do, and the temperature inside didn't collapse the way it collapsed in every other structure in the basin. Nash was on the floor by the hearth, with the quilt around him, still losing the fight because the floor was earth and the earth was cold. The ride had driven the cold deep into his core, and his body was giving up the heat faster than the room could give it back. She made the decision without asking him. She crossed to the stove and slid the wooden panel open, fully this time, in front of the only other person who had ever seen it, and the warm glow rolled out into the room like a breath held all day and finally let go. Inside the thick clay wall was a sleeping alcove, a low chamber she had carved and shaped and built the whole stove around, long enough for a body, in line with the futon she had carried off the wagon in October, the pale cloth glowing faint in the stored heat. The clay around it was warm to the cheek, warm the way a living body is warm, because it had been drinking the fire for hours and now was giving the heat back into the only space in the cabin that the cold couldn't reach. She put him in the alcove because he was the one dying. There was no argument, no explanation, because the man was half frozen, and explanation was a luxury the night didn't allow. She helped him onto the futon and slid the panel to, and left it open a hand's width, and the warmth of the clay closed around him like a hand around a coal. For herself, she took the floor by the banked hearth, wrapped in the quilt, and she slept the way the old country sleeps, small heat held close, the body against the warm wall, and the wall against the night. The physics paid off in the dark, and it didn't need to be spoken to be true. Through the worst night in the history of the basin, while the town's big houses went cold, and Crane's fine rooms froze, and the cattle locked standing in the fields, the clay wall stayed warm, and the alcove stayed warm, and the two people inside it survived. The fool's oven, the joke of Coyote Springs, was the only structure for 50 miles that the cold couldn't crack, because it didn't fight the winter the way the town fought it, with big fires and big rooms. It held the heat close and let it out slow, and the difference between the two ideas was the difference between a living man and a frozen one. Nash lay in the alcove with the warm clay against his back and the slow heat in his bones. And sometime in the deep of the night the shaking stopped and the cold retreated, and he understood what she had built. It wasn't a stove. It was a shelter inside a shelter, a bed inside a wall, a small warm place carved out of the kind of dense clay that remembers fire. And he understood something else too, quieter than the first thing, which was that she had given him the warm place and taken the cold floor for herself. And she had done it without a word, the way a person does a thing when the doing of it's the whole of the reason. And outside that warm wall, the town that had spent 2 months laughing was about to learn what the cold really costs. The storm broke at dawn, the way those storms break, sudden and total, the wind dropping to nothing and the sky going pale and the world emerging white and still and ruined. The cold stayed, but the air stopped moving, and the town came up out of its houses like people surfacing from deep water, blinking frost in their beards, counting who was left. Smoky rose from the chimneys that still drew, and the ones that didn't drew nothing, and the silence on the street was the silence of a place that had been beaten and wasn't yet sure how badly. They came down to the creek because her chimney was the one drawing straightest, a clean line of smoke into a still sky, and because the cabin was the one place the cold hadn't managed to kill. Crane led them, or rather Crane was among them, and he was frostbitten across the cheeks and the fingers, and he had the look of a man who has spent a night learning the limit of his own money. They stood at her door in a knot, the same men who had leaned on the fence to lap at the foundation, and she opened it, and the warmth rolled out into the cold morning like an answer to every wager they had laid. She didn't gloat, because gloating wasn't a thing she owned. She fed them, boiling the soba and broth, and setting out the rice, and pouring tea from the lacquered case, and the men ate standing because there was no room to sit, and they ate the way starving men eat, with their hands shaking and their eyes on the food. The wooden panel stood open against the wall, and the futon was visible inside the alcove, and every man in the room saw it, and not one of them laughed, because the alcove was the warmest thing any of them had felt in 16 hours, and the laughing had frozen out of them overnight. Crane looked at the panel a long time, and then he looked at her, and then he walked out without a word. And the claim on the creek lot went with him. Because a man who has stood in a warm room he mocked for 2 months can't keep the bet and the room both. The wager was forgotten, not paid, and not collected, because the town understood by morning that the woman had won it without ever touching the pot. Nash stayed to help dig out the stock and mend the shutters, and he stayed after that, and she let him stay. And the letting was its own kind of answer. The wooden panel stood open in the wall, and the futon lay inside it, and the clay held the day's fire till morning, the way it always had. The smartest thing on the frontier was the thing no one understood, and the woman who built it never once asked to be believed. Drop a comment with your city, and I want to see how far this story travels across the world.